we're now seeing in real time what happens when Uber and Lyft leaves an area. And trust me when I say, what's going on in Minneapolis is going to have a massive, massive effect on the rest of the country and potentially the future of ride sharing. Now, I'm going to show you a couple quick articles. You can see right away kind of the main point of it, that Uber and Lyft departure. Taxi company says it's prepared to hire. The Blue and White Taxi owns 4 of the 6 cab companies listed as licensed in Minneapolis. So, as you can imagine, with Uber and Lyft potentially leaving, a lot of these companies, taxi companies and ride-sharing companies, are gearing up and getting prepared. And I will do like a mini recap at the end of this video, like I typically do, where I show you an article and then talk about it. But trust me, what's going on right now, I'm very, very observant. I've been looking at this almost every day because I'm like, all right, it's super interesting and very indicative as a very, very big example of what would happen if Uber and Lyft leaves another area. Not just in terms of Uber and Lyft leaving the area per se, but also to let them know, like, hey, if someone calls their bluff, like, oh, we're going to leave or whatever, we might be able to argue that Uber and Lyft can't use that excuse anymore. That Uber and Lyft says, oh, shoot, before we thought, oh, if we leave, people are going to be pissed. They can't do anything. But now it's like, no, if we leave, we don't care. We'll be fine without you, right? So you can see here that a Minneapolis spokesperson says 39 taxi companies were licensed in the city in 2014. As you can imagine, it went a bit lower. Going here, I'm going to skip down right here. Uber Lyft vowed to leave Minneapolis on May 1st, like I've talked about in a bunch of videos, following council's decision to require rideshare companies to raise driver pay. Sunbull says he's getting more inquiries from drivers looking for work. We know a lot of drivers at Uber and Lyft, and keep in mind there's over 10,000 people, over 10,000 jobs now that are going to be gone from rideshare drivers because they can't drive anymore. So there's a lot of drivers at Uber and Lyft, and they've asked us if they can come board if this happens, and we've said, look, let's just wait and see what happens. So this is something I will say, it's going to be interesting to see what happens because there is some talk about them reversing this as well. So this could all be speculation, but they said they're even reconsidering the ordinance and a possible vote on April 11th. And they said he doubts the companies will leave, but says Blue and White is prepared to hire drivers if they do leave, right? So they do have these kind of nitty-gritty things here that within a day we would be able to hire between or add 50 to 75. It would still be their own vehicles. They would just need to download our driver app. For us, the only difference is we'd want to put cameras in their cars, which I think is a really good idea. I've talked about this in a bunch of videos. Have a dash cam in your car. So taxi companies are already gearing up. Then going here, for example, Minneapolis considers to give, let me X this out, $150K to support new rideshare companies because they're leaving on May 1st. The council said that it will consider funding to help support new rideshare companies looking to replace Uber and Lyft services when they leave the city. Going down here, it creates a path for new local startup companies that are looking to fill the void. Some of the companies that have expressed interest include Move, Pika app, Rides, and Empower. Now, I just want to show you those quick headlines or the quick titles of those articles because my big thing is this. I've been so hyper-focused on this, as you can tell, with what's going on in Minneapolis, mainly because this is going to be a huge example and epitome of what happens when Uber and Lyft leaves an area. Nothing like this has ever happened. And yes, I know you could argue Austin back in 2016, but it's not the same. 2016 was still the infancy of ride sharing. I remember a lot of people said, hey, I think Uber and Lyft's a scam, or I don't trust it. Like now, ride sharing is everywhere. It's such a huge part in our society. Hotels have revamped their structure for ride sharing. If you say, hey, I'm going to get an Uber, everyone knows what that means. Even in 2016, when I said the term Uber Lyft, a lot of people were like, wait, that's what you get in strangers' cars, right? Like why, right? So two very different markets, 2016 until now. And there's a lot of talk about this. And like I said, this is showing a couple different things. One, what would ride sharing, or I'm not even gonna say ride sharing, I guess. What would a given market look like without Lyft and Uber? How would the other ride sharing apps and taxis, how would they look without Lyft and Uber? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, this is going to be a sign to, I think, put some pressure on Uber and Lyft to realize they can't really do this kind of pull-out method anymore, right? And it's super annoying, and I've said this before in other videos, that Uber and Lyft says, hey, we can't do this, we're just going to leave. And I think they do it almost as kind of this game of chicken, where Uber and Lyft says, you know what, we're just going to leave. And then Uber and Lyft probably maybe doesn't want to leave, but they kind of say it, and the city says, oh shoot, can we exist without Uber and Lyft? I know a big talk in Minneapolis right now is the airport. I know that's a huge issue, is they're like, well, okay, ride sharing exists for numerous different situations, whether you want to get to and from the bar on a Friday night and be safe and responsible, whether you get to work, whether you don't have a car, but a big one is the airport. That's going to have a huge issue when it comes to transportation. But it could be that the city might be fine without Uber and Lyft. It is tough to say, because obviously it's one thing to see how it might look on paper, and nothing in practicality, but this is a big story that I'm just very curious. Now, granted, there is going to be some next month, there is going to be more talk about, should we reverse this? Should we maybe not put in that minimum wage law and everything to raise rates for drivers so Uber and Lyft does stay? Can we exist without Uber and Lyft? These are all big questions, but I think here's the big issue. When it comes to all this going on, even though there's a lot of talk with taxis, even though there's a lot of talk about other ride-sharing companies, and I have done some videos about what would it look like if another ride-sharing company took place and all this kind of stuff, the main issue is, I think, Uber and Lyft. I remember seeing a bunch of analytics and statistics and surveys about this. Uber and Lyft can afford to make it work. There was a huge study that was done where they reviewed over 1 billion rides, a billion with a B, billion rides with Uber and Lyft in places like Chicago and New York and other areas. And they found that even though Uber and Lyft said, oh, we can't afford the minimum wage law, they actually can. They just say this because, of course, they're companies, they're businesses, and they want to make more money. That's the only reason why they say that, but they truly can actually afford it. Now, granted, I will say this. Of course, Minneapolis is a very different place than New York. And I said before in a previous video that when this happened in California with Prop 22, Lyft and Uber did kind of use this chicken game. They're like, oh, if it doesn't go our way, we're leaving. Luckily, or maybe unluckily, depending on how you look at it, drivers here stay as independent contractors, but they get a minimum wage. Same thing happened in New York City. So this was able to work. However, I do understand California and New York are the biggest ride-sharing hubs. And in a smaller one, there might just not be enough traffic and rides to happen to make it work mathematically for Uber and Lyft. And then they bring up all these excuses of, well, it's going to raise rates for passengers. You're going to have to pay double or whatever. What do you typically pay? I still think Uber and Lyft could make it work. Now, granted, I might be wrong. I could heavily be wrong. I've not seen the exact accounting on Uber and Lyft's side, the nitty-gritty, so I could be wrong. But I think the biggest thing is this. This is going to show for a common area, and I've said this before in other videos, for your average area, what things will look like if Uber and Lyft does leave. And like I said, they're already gearing up. And so I think it's really interesting because on May 1st, what will happen? We could see, maybe Uber and Lyft doesn't leave. Maybe they're like, oh, we're going to leave. Their bluff gets called, and they're like, you know what? Yeah, sorry, we're not. But Uber and Lyft are such big companies. They're doing fine financially. So to them, it's like, if they leave, will they lose out on money? Yes, but is Minneapolis like a massive market for ride sharing that's going to be a huge percentage of their profits? I don't know 100%, but probably not as big of an impact compared to, like, say, a bigger city. So maybe Uber and Lyft does leave. The next thing is, how will Minneapolis do in then those few months to come if Uber and Lyft does leave? Because, let's say, taxis ramp up their inventory and their drivers, and they start doing fine. Let's say other ride-sharing companies come in place, take over, they do fine. That's going to be a huge kind of power difference, because I think one thing we kind of underestimate, or maybe not, although I think a lot of people do, is they underestimate how much power Uber and Lyft really has. I mean, the fact that Uber and Lyft can say, hey, we don't like what you guys are doing, we're just going to leave this area, and that councils and lawmakers and legislation will actually change and revert their laws back or switch things up because of Uber and Lyft leaving, shows the power that Uber and Lyft has. And I said that before, that by definition, technically, it's not really a monopoly because you have Uber and Lyft. But in a sense, I feel like it is a bit of a monopoly. That Uber and Lyft, even though it's usually Uber versus Lyft, when something like this happens, they usually pair together and kind of follow suit. It would be interesting to see, I will say as a side note, if let's say Uber says, you know what, we're leaving, and Lyft says, we're going to stay. We're going to stay. That'd be a very interesting power dynamic, but there is power in numbers, and with Uber and Lyft both leaving, that's going to be a huge thing, and that's why I'm very curious to see if there would be ever something passed about this, because like I said, Uber and Lyft has such a powerhouse and a stranglehold. Like I've said before, when it comes to like Coke and Pepsi, for example, people use it very similar to Uber and Lyft, but they're two very, very different things. Like it'd be super weird. If Coke and Pepsi said, hey, you know what? We don't like this new soda law being passed in Minneapolis. We're going to leave. People will be like, all right. There's other soda companies. Yeah, you're the two biggest, but one, there's other companies, and two, it's not like we rely on soda to live, but a lot of people rely on ride sharing to get around. I don't know. It's going to be tough. And like I said, they're gearing up. They're preparing for this huge moment. And that's why I've been looking. We're only a month-ish away, really, from something like this happening. And there's a lot of unanswered questions. Will this be rolled back? Like I said in that article, I think it's on April 11th. They're going to have another kind of meeting about this. Will it actually happen? But I think the biggest thing is this. Regardless of how this goes, regardless if, like, say, the city does roll it back and Uber and Lyft continues to stay, regardless if Uber and Lyft does leave and other ride-sharing companies and taxi companies kind of fill their spot, the fact that Uber and Lyft has this much power to do something like this is, to me, what causes an issue. And even though they are getting ready and are getting prepared, there's been a lot of talk in numerous different ways of what's going to happen with transportation in that area, like I've showed you with these articles, and there's a lot of them online right now as well. It still brings up this fundamental fact that if you're preparing this much for May 1st, and there's numerous articles and taxi companies and rideshare companies and lawmakers talking about what they're going to do, that just shows the power that Uber and Lyft has, which isn't good, right? That definitely is not good when it comes to what could be considered a somewhat monopoly, but it kind of isn't because it's two different, very separate companies. I know, but at the end of the day, the biggest thing is this. Regardless of what happens, this is still going to be a huge epitome for future situations with ride sharing. If something like, say, like a minimum wage or minimum hourly guarantee will take place everywhere, this is going to be, I think, kind of like a unique case study, so to speak, of what will happen, right? If Uber and Lyft doesn't leave and they roll it back, Uber and Lyft could say, hey, let's say another area, take like another small city like Oklahoma City, says, you know what, we're going to do a minimum wage. Uber and Lyft could say, hey, remember what happened in Minneapolis? They were going to do it. They decided not to because they could see the impact it had. We're going to leave too. Which gives Uber and Lyft this huge power and this huge stranglehold on different cities and their lawmakers to kind of get their way because they just don't want to be spending more money for drivers. In addition, if Uber and Lyft does leave and Minneapolis is, for the most part, fine, or they figure it out, that definitely shifts kind of the power dynamic when now other cities can say, hey, you know what? Uber and Lyft said they were going to leave. They left. And they're doing okay. Maybe we can do the same and pay drivers now fairly the way they should be getting paid. This whole thing's a mess. It's a whole kind of gamble right now. But one thing's for sure. There's a lot of things happening on both sides with Uber and Lyft potentially leaving and Minneapolis getting geared up for the fact that they might potentially leave. Either way, this is going to be a big story for the future to see what will happen in other cities.